All right, we're going to talk about model layer. And that is, again, to kind of orient ourselves. When you have a view that you need to get some data onto, you probably need to make a call to the database. I honestly, and I think this has been the mystery that a lot of us on the artisanal collections track of the Dev2 project have been trying to figure out, is like, where is the data coming from on the readings list component? And I'm pretty sure it's using Algolia search, which is then making a call to the database. So that is going to be an exception to what I'm about to talk about, which is like the normal Rails way that you get data. Yeah, so that with that like caveat, we're going to talk about, like, I'm going to give you an example from Dev2 that does do it more of the normal way. All right, so first of all, can I get like a general feeling for like how much have you front-end folks interacted with SQL and relational databases?
Not at all.
Not at all. Awesome. Fantastic.
I have, but I'm the exception.
Okay.
Good luck to
They
you.
didn't teach us, yeah.
All right. This is awesome. No, I love it. I like enjoy SQL to a level that it probably is not sane. I find it interesting. I inherited being a DBA at a company that I worked for, because the other one quit and no one else wanted to learn, basically. Worked with it for a while. It's a very different kind of technology. The way that you write SQL queries is just a different kind of logic from the way that you would write JavaScript or Ruby or any kind of typical programming language. And the way that relational databases are structured can be weird at first. But I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an overview. In SQL or relational databases, RDBs, information is stored on tables. If you could think of a table as a Google Sheet. So it's going to start a new one here. So let's say this is a table, sheet 1, right? Let's say this
Not seeing your screen yet if you're sharing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Joel. All right, so let's say we've got a Google Sheet, and we've got multiple sheets within an overall spreadsheet project. So let's say we've got users, we have, let's say we've got items as a second one. In a relational database, you can have multiple tables, and each table represents a kind of resource. On any given table, there is a column which is going to have a unique identifier, which is often called ID. And it's typically going to be auto-incrementing integers. So it's going to be 1, 2. Actually, I'm going to do a little bit of meta programming here. Yes. You can. Well, I just showed what kind of jobs I've had. So there's usually like a unique identifier in one column, which is the primary key. And there are other columns that are often sometimes called fields, or attributes. So you could have, if we're talking user, we might have name, address, favorite color, sure. And then say we have items over here. Items also going to have a primary key. And we could just, for example's sake, take this. And maybe this is name, price, stock, or whatever. If you wanted to talk about the relationships between these objects, then you might have, let's say there was a third table which had a company. And we knew that each item belonged to a company. Then you might have, let's say you had the company ID is 1, is Amazon. And we knew that item 5 of loofahs, which cost $20,000. If we wanted to know which company to associate this with, we would have a foreign ID on the items table, which corresponds to the primary key of the row of the particular company that we want to associate it with. Okay, so we're going to have company ID 1. And that is how, that's in a nutshell, that's how relational databases track the relationships between the different tables. Through, and this, in this case, this is, I don't know if I already said this, but this is a foreign ID, or a foreign key, sorry. And a foreign key is just the primary key from a different table being referenced on a different, on a table to relate them. That way, instead of having to duplicate all of the company information, so you could put this all in one spreadsheet and say company name, company address, company phone, and you could duplicate it. So you could have Amazon, Seattle thing. I'm running out of ideas. But you could, instead of duplicating it, and the problem of duplication, right, is that it creates a lot of margin for error and it takes up more space on the server itself. Referring to something simply by a unique identifier allows you to keep all of that company's information in one place, and then use SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language, to be able to find the things that you need. So the cost and the benefit of relational databases is that it's harder to get all of the information that you need. And that's where NoSQL databases have a benefit, like MongoDB, which do duplicate information. They store everything in one big row. But with SQL databases, everything's much more organized. It's much more clean. It's more reliable. But it means that you have to use SQL to say, I want to know the company phone number of all the company phone numbers of all the items with a price less than $15,000. SQL lets you do really complex queries to get you back the information that you need, which is great unless you don't know SQL, and unless you're in a object-oriented programming environment where you're not dealing with cells and columns and tables, you're interacting with different data types entirely. So to surmount that, what Rails does is it comes shipped with ActiveRecord, which is a library, a built-in library that is an object relational mapper, which kind of does exactly what it sounds like it does. It wraps data from a relational database in objects so that you could interact with your relational data as if each table was a class and each row on that table were an instance of that class. So to take my spreadsheet example, in ActiveRecord, you might have a users class, and then each row is going to be an instance of users. So, and I'm gonna show what this specifically looks like in Dev 2 in a second. But the other benefit to ActiveRecord is that it allows you to interact with the database using Ruby instead of SQL, by basically turning your ActiveRecord methods into SQL queries behind the scenes. So, like I said, for each table in the database, there will be a model class. And where these live is kind of like you would probably guess is under app/models. So I need to give you a different example because, again, reading list isn't a good one. So we're going to look at the main loop of articles. So this was in a gist that I posted earlier in the channel where the artisanal collection teams are collaborating. If you want it, I can get it to you. It's also under my GitHub account, but I'm going to take us through. I'm going to take us through the article. How do you get to the actual article show page? Because I think this has some good stuff in it. So if we trace this, let's start back at the beginning. So we're on Dev 2. I'm going to mouse over this this link to an article. And I don't know if you can see it. You might need to pull it up on your browser. But what I'm seeing in the bottom left corner is, no, go back. Dev 2, gosh dang it. Dev 2 slash SLKD7700 slash day 3 in web development, something, something, something. Okay, so I'm going to say interesting. If we go to routes.rb, which again is under the config folder, I am going to look for, and I need to check my notes real quick. Yes. This one was tricky to find because it's all dynamic segments. So on line 391, sorry, not 391, 407, there's a route to get / username symbol / slug symbol / view. And I kind of had to reverse engineer figuring out where this was because it's not clear by looking at it what it does, right? But it is going to, like we talked about earlier, take those 3 values. So in this case, this was SLKD7700 is probably the username. If I mouse over the author's name, I'm getting a URL to SLKD7700. So it's probably a correct assumption. And then it's / a string, hyphenated string that looks like the name of the article, right? So we come back here, we're gonna say, okay, we don't have a view on it, but let's assume that that's optional for now. It's gonna take us to stories controller, show method. So we're gonna go to app, controllers, stories controller, and there's a whole lot of code at the head of this. We're gonna skip that for now and go to the show action. All right, we are going to now take a look at this line, which is where a lot of the action is happening. The first thing that this controller action does is set an instance variable to true. We don't know what that's doing. We'll just ignore it for right now. And it says if this, and there's no Boolean comparison here, so it's just checking to see like, does it exist or is it null or nil? In Ruby, it's nil instead of null. I don't know why. Okay, so we're gonna say, what is it looking for? It's saying @article equals article dot FindBy, and then it has path, and it has this long thing. This is very similar to React. In React, you can interpolate things by just putting curly braces, I believe. In Ruby, the hash symbol followed by a set of curly braces means you're going to interpolate the return value of whatever this code is and put it, turn it into a string and add it to whatever string you're inside. Does that language make sense to you guys?
Yeah, definitely. It's the same in script, except instead of the quotes, you'd have backticks, and then you'd have a $ instead of the hash.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So we're interpolating the username, right, which in the route was the first part of the URI path, downcased. This is a built-in string method in Ruby, and / the slug, which was the second part of that URI. And right now there's nothing about a view, so I feel comfortable about the assumption that this is optional. And then it does, this is a, I can't remember offhand the name of this syntax, but it basically is saying run this method on whatever came before it. So, and I'll explain what that does in a second. So let's break this down. In here, what we've got is, so we've gotten through the GET request, went to this route, took us to stories controller, took us to the show action. Yes. And it does some other stuff which you're going to come back to, but it declared an article instance variable which runs an ActiveRecord query against the article model. So when you see this capital A article, this is, and it's going to be hard to know like what kind of, because everything in Rails is a class, it's kind of hard to know like what is this. But this is one of the most frequent things, like patterns in Rails that you will see, is that inside of a show action, you're probably going to find a single instance of a resource by the information that was in the path. So I talked earlier about the like organizations/ID. This is very similar to that scenario. But anyway, long story short, we're going to go look at the article model, which is under app/models article. You can see a ton of stuff. I wouldn't worry about it right now. I'd be happy to answer questions about that. Oh my gosh, there's so much stuff. Lots and lots of stuff. Stuff. Where is the where are the methods? Okay, so real quick note on Ruby classes. We talked earlier about self dot being a reference to whatever instance or class you're in. There's one particular tricky way that it treats self dot, which is that Ruby classes can have instance methods, which are inherited by instances of that class. They can also have class methods, which can be called on the class itself. So, and the way to define those is by doing def self dot. And this tells you that this is a class method, which can be called on the article class without having to instantiate it. So I could do article dot, not here obviously, but somewhere else. I could do article dot active threads, and it would run this class method. Whereas if you did def active threads without the self dot, then I would need to call this on an instance of class. So maybe like instance of class equals article.new arguments instance of class dot active threads. So just so you know what you're looking at, if it has self dot on the method definition line, it's a class method. If it does not have self dot, then it is an instance method. Quick aside. So I'm gonna look through here. I happen to know that FindBy. Oops, did I lose? Yes, I did. Yeah, we were looking at stories controller. Yeah. Okay. So I happen to know that .findBy is a method that is provided to article by ActiveRecord. So models all inherit from ApplicationRecord. ApplicationRecord is very similar to application controller. It's a root class that all of the models inherit from. The Rails convention is when you have something like that, it's often application and then whatever kind of thing it is. So ApplicationRecord is the class that all of the ActiveRecord model classes inherit from. So you could go and look at the application record file under models, and you could see what's in here. Application record, kind of like application controller inherited from application controller base. Application record inherits from ActiveRecord base. And so a lot of the core functionality is hidden inside the source code. So if you go in here and look for a FindBy method, you're not going to find one because it's one of the built-in methods that is provided by ActiveRecord base. Unfortunately, that's something that I can't provide you with a handy rule of thumb, but I will drop a link to there's one core page on the ActiveRecord docs, which has everything, and it's very exhaustive. And it's like, we keep it, at least I keep it open all the time. When I'm working with ActiveRecord or any kind of Rails project. But just to bring it back around, .findBy is an ActiveRecord method that will try to find a particular row on the articles table in the database by a particular column, or in this case, we call it by a particular attribute. So what it's going to do is it will run a SQL query against the database. And here, there are two ways that you can get into like what is in our dev2 database. One of them is to actually get some kind of graphic interface to access the database, and I would highly recommend downloading Postico. Postico will let you connect to your local PostgreSQL database. If you're doing it from scratch, you would click New Favorite. You can put literally anything you want in here, but just leave for nickname, but leave all of the other fields blank. You just want it to look at localhost. You would hit Done, and then you would click Connect. I already did that, so I'm going to click that. This is all of my PostgreSQL databases that have ever been created across all of our Rails projects, so it's full of stuff. But you would find the dev2 database in here. To figure out what it's going to be named, and also to show you the other way to look at what's in the database, in the DB directory, there's a schema.rb file. The schema.rb file is a record of all of the tables and columns that have been created in the database by Rails. And so you can go through here and you can see, for example, let's go ahead and find, I'm going to look for article. Okay, so I found this. You're going to find, okay, create table articles. And you can find a list of all of the all of the columns that have been created and their types. So you can see string, abuse removal reason, Boolean. You'll also see in here, if there's a default value, it will be defined in here. Sometimes you'll see null is false, which tells you that it is required in order to create a new record, which is another word for a row in a relational database, is record. In order to create a new record in the database on this table, this field cannot be null. Yes, and this is an extremely long table. This is the second largest table in the database. If you've looked at the ERD, got lots and lots of stuff. But to come back to Postico, if you, oh no, wait, I was going to show you how to get to it. This is not that place. I got turned around. So this is one place that you can look to remind yourself, like what columns are on this particular table. You can come into DB schema.rb and look at it here. But if you want to find the name of the table, you would look under config database.yaml, and it will have a list of the configuration settings for your databases. The one that you're going to primarily look at is your development database. And it gives you the name of it after the database key. So we're going to look for practical developer _ development. So if I pop back to Postco, I see I've got it here. So I double click. I have a list of all of the tables. I want to look at articles. And you can look at it as if it were one big spreadsheet, basically. There's a bunch of stuff that Postgre lets you do. You can come in here and change values. If you want to like mess around with stuff to get different results, or just to see what the effect is on the output on the actual deployed app. If you change something, you have to come in here and click Save Changes. Don't know how I'm going to fix that, but there we go. And if you do know SQL, you can run SQL queries against the database live by double-clicking SQL query. And you could do SQL stuff. So I could do select all from articles, execute, and it'll give me the results of the SQL query, which is cool.
The whole table in this case.
Basically the whole table. Yeah. I don't know why I got 25 rows, but whatever, that's cool. So that's Postgre. Postgre is extremely helpful for being like, what's actually in the database. Yeah, so when you do in this, to bring it back around, when we do article.findby, this argument right here is telling us, is instructing ActiveRecord to look for this particular attribute and try to match it with this value. And so I'm going to say, okay, that's interesting. So what's the path? What does that look like? So I'm going to go, oops, I closed that. So I'm going to go back to Postgre. And I'm going to go to practical developer development. I'm going to look at articles, and I'm going to scroll over to the path. Path. Here we go, the path column. And I'm going to see, well, look at that. It's a user / that hyphenated string. So we can see that what this is doing under the hood is saying, hey, go find, and FindBy finds the first result. If there's more than one match, it'll just return the first one. There's another ActiveRecord method called where, which you would use if you wanted to find all of the matching ones. So FindBy is find a single one by a particular attribute. It's taking that username, downcased, and the slug, it's slapping them together, it's looking it up, it's finding a single one, and it's returning a single article object. And it's storing that in the @article instance variable. And if it finds one, and I'm going to ignore this right now, there's some notes in my gist about it, but it's going to run, if it finds one, it's going to run the handle article show method, and we'll go see what that does. Just we'll skip over this. We'll say see what else it's doing. It's saying if it finds the article by a slug, so like it didn't find the full path, but the slug matched an existing slug. So if we go back to Postgre, we can see that there's a slug column, which just has that hyphenated string. Then it's going to do a handle possible redirect, which I'm going to assume has to do with like what the logic for like, hey, there's a matching slug, but not a matching username. What do we do? And then the else block is a bunch of stuff about podcast episodes. So I know that that's not related to what we're looking for. So I'm going to say, okay, let's go back to what does handle article show do? And I find myself at a method much further down the page, def handle article show. It does a bunch of stuff. So it's going to run 3 consecutive methods. It's going to break, again, return immediately followed by a conditional is just going to stop the method kind of mid-process. But if it gets past that, it's going to render a template articles/show. This is, again, very similar to what we were talking about earlier with just plain old render. It's going to look for a file under the views subdirectory. So I'm going to go app, views, and in this case, it's given me told me what subdirectory of views to look in. So I'm going to go in articles, and I'm going to look for show. And we have a show. We have two actually. Show.html.erb. I think template is instructing it to probably to look for the HTML file. So we found ourselves at search show.html.erb. And you can see that unlike the reading list, it immediately starts doing a bunch of stuff with @article. So, and I've been talking a lot really fast, so I'm going to pause real quick. What questions do y'all have so far?
I think it makes sense to me.
Sweet.
They're doing, the
I
way
kinda
to run
wanted
queries.
to maybe mention real quick too, like thinking about ActiveRecord. For me, it was really helpful knowing that like ActiveRecord is like the means by which you go into your database and then like convert that raw data into objects that are like easier to work with. I don't know if you
Yes.
said that, Daniel. I can't remember.
No, yeah, that's where I was going next. So thank you, Carly, for that perfect segue. So,
Sweet.
so I was talking earlier about how ActiveRecord is an object relational mapper. So that means that when it goes into the database and it finds and it found that matching row, what it returned is not a hash, not an array, not any kind of static data type. It is an instance of the article class, and by virtue of that, it has by default it has reader methods for every attribute on the table. So if we go back to we could look at it in post-to-co, or we could look at the schema.rb. But I can count on this article object having an ID method, a getter method, an abuse, remove this thing, allow big edits, getter method, an amount paid, getter method. So we could do @article dot slug. We know that that's going to be a thing. We could do @article dot path. Any column in the database, there's going to be a getter method for that, and the value is going to be that record's value from that row in the database. So when we get to here, and the controller has done the work of interacting with the model, that's why this is a much better illustration of the process. So like we've gone through routing, we went to the controller. The controller sent a message to the model, say, hey, find this thing. The model did the work of interacting with the database using SQL, and it returned an object. The controller sent that object to the view. Now the view is using that object to render its data before it is sent back to the user as HTML. So we've got, so for example, this one is going to say, hey, the title is @article, not title. I don't know exactly what that's doing, but that's a thing. You can see that it's rendering some JavaScript pack tags. So there's some components already in the works. It's doing stuff with the article ID, the article updated at. It's doing stuff with @article.processed_HTML. Bunch of stuff. It's doing @article. Yeah, okay. So you can see it's doing a bunch of stuff with that object that it returned. So this is a more standard use case for Rails in terms of how the MVC framework typically flows. And the convention with views is that you send a single object to the view from the controller, so that the so that the view is kept as clean as possible and knows as little about the rest of the code base as possible. That way the view can have single responsibility and all the other OOP principles, right? It only needs to know about one object and its methods. To come back around real quick to the decorate thing that I skipped. When it called .decorate on the found article object, what it did was it ran it through a thing called a decorator. And again, this is another Ruby class in Rails that does a very specific job. Decorators, which are also sometimes called facades, basically take an object and they add additional behavior to it, often like presentation logic. How is it going to get formatted when it's on the page? Will go into a decorator or a facade, so that you can keep that kind of presentation logic separate from the data logic that belongs on the model. So in the case of article, the data logic is on the article model. So if we come down here, we're going to see that there's probably, what was one of those methods? One of those methods that we saw being used was processed HTML. I have a feeling it's not going to be here. It's probably going to be here. No, never mind. That was a wrong example. But there are probably going to be methods that the view calls on @article that don't come from the model, they come from the decorator. And again, the decorator is just a way of like abstracting out the presentation logic for a particular object from the data logic, so that their responsibilities are more separated. Why was I talking about that? Yes.
So I had a quick question. I think we're about to run out of time here again.
Yes.
So is it generally always using ActiveRecord on the back end for Ruby, or do you guys often also run SQL queries separate of that, or is it?
We're typically always going through ActiveRecord so that we can get objects, but we sometimes mix in actual SQL fragments into our ActiveRecord queries. So ActiveRecord has like a spectrum of, you can have pure ActiveRecord, or you can kind of mix in SQL if you want to make your ActiveRecord queries more specific. Yeah.
Cool.
And I'll send you guys a link to those docs. Yeah, I don't think that you'll need to interact with that at all.
Yeah.
But in case you run up against something. So cool. I'm gonna stop the recording here, and then like we could boot it back up, and anybody who wants to ask specific questions, we can just hang out for a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, this was super thorough. I appreciate it, Daniel.
Sweet.
I gotta actually hop off because I know the call right now, but I really appreciate going through all this.
Excellent.